We are live. Welcome, everybody.
Yes, welcome everyone to another event in our series of lectures, chats, and talks with the Canadian Macedonian Historical Society. My name is Alexander Nitsis, and I'm the Vice President. I'm in this seat, in this capacity, to welcome you because our president is on a flight coming back home to Toronto as we speak. So he was not able to join us. We don't have that technology where you could join right from the plane. But anyway, welcome. We've been in existence as a nonprofit, a charity, a registered charity from 1991. And we have been conducting many lectures, many events, and documenting the history of our people coming to Canada and immigrating to Canada. We have our oral history videos, and even during this time of COVID, we've been able to record some of those oral histories. We continue to do that in this capacity of Zoom. Hopefully by June, we may be able to have a live event outdoors, maybe resurrect the picnic, that annual picnic that's been a mainstay for Macedonians since they came to Toronto. And that was one of the first ones was at the Humber River by the old mill. So we're looking forward to that. And hopefully we'll get some more information to you by the end of this month on that event. But again, I'd like to welcome everyone, and I will pass it on to our social media director, Stephanie, and she will give you some more information about our event this evening and about some upcoming events. So Stephanie, if you can take it over.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Alex. Welcome this evening. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. As it says up on the screen, please use the chat functionality throughout Christina's session tonight to ask any questions which you may have of her. I'm sure there will be many. I'll be moderating that chat with Alex throughout the call, and we'll be taking stock of your questions and making sure that they all get answered at the end. Just a few reminders as well. For those of you that are in the audience tonight that are not a member yet, we urge you and ask that you please check out our website, macedonianhistory.ca, and consider becoming a member. For those of you that are, thank you again for joining, and thank you for your patronage. It helps us to put on talks like this and to connect with our community. Also, we wanted to remind you guys that we do have another upcoming talk in just a few weeks on Sunday, May 28th, and we hope that you'll join us for that as well. We're going to be having an excellent discussion with Professor Marian Markovic from the University of Skopje's Department of Macedonian and Slavic Languages, and we're going to really be continuing the exciting conversation we're having tonight around the Macedonian language with an exploration of Aegean dialects. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Virginia Evans, our Director of Events, to introduce our esteemed guest tonight. Over to you, Ginny.
Thank you very much. It's with most of our members, we don't need to introduce Christina Kramer, Professor Emerita to our audience. She was the professor of Slavic and Balkan languages and linguistics at the University of Toronto, and the author of the language textbook of Macedonian, a course for beginning and intermediate students. The Society had a book launch for this book at that time. She taught many a student at the U of T, including Dan Mallon and myself, the fine art of speaking, writing, and loving the language of Macedonian. I believe that she was introduced to our culture through music and dance. And when she went to graduate school, she began visiting Macedonia, first for the summer language course in Ohrid, and then for a year on a Fulbright research grant. Since retirement, well, she never stops. She has been heavily into translation, both books and poetry. She's translated from Macedonian, Bulgarian, Albanian into English, and while being fluent in Russian as well. Christina is an amazing person, and we as a community are very honored to have her here today. Her latest work includes selected poetry of Aco Shopov from Macedonian to be published in 2022 by Deep Vellum Press with co-translator Rauli Grau, as well as the book No, Oui by Lydia Dimkovska from Macedonian, forthcoming in 2022 by Autumn Hill. She translated her previous novel called A Spare Life, and that was a wonderful book. I loved it. She has lots of other projects on the go that you can ask her about. Today, she's going to talk about a project that began literally a couple of weeks before the lockdown in March 2020. She was interested in continuing research on Macedonian in the diaspora, something she began researching shortly after moving to Toronto in the 1980s. For this project, a questionnaire was sent to those in the community who had little knowledge of the Macedonian language a couple of years ago, and was the basis for a paper to be presented by Christina in Japan. With the pandemic, many plans changed and altered, and now let her tell you just how and what those first questionnaires reveal and how that will shape future research. Christina, over to you.
Virginia, that's as gracious as ever. I thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. That is the plan. Voila. So what I'm talking about today, as Virginia told you, was sort of this very funny idea I had, and some of you in different venues have heard parts of this. So you've heard these ideas developing. I gave a talk for UMD. I gave a talk to the Macedonian Students Association at University of Toronto. I've been trying to work through an idea that I'm going to explicate to you today. I had this great idea that in retirement, I was going to develop a questionnaire, and I was going to bring together 3 generations of the families who filled out the questionnaires, and they would fill out these questionnaires as a 3-generational unit. And then I would conduct in-person interviews with the 3 generations present to see language interaction across generations. This brilliant idea I had in February of 2020. I got back some questionnaires, and then the lockdown happened. So on the basis of about, I don't know, I think I had 15 different people with 3 generations giving me some data. So it's very early data. So I'm going to talk you through, I want to actually take you through some of the thinking behind the questionnaire I developed. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm trying to get at with the questionnaire. And then I want to tell you some of the things that these very early questionnaires reveal. And I hope that you come out of this realizing that you may actually know more Macedonian than you think you do. So if you've heard me speak before, you'll know that every talk I do on language for Macedonian in so many ways to get to the critical position we are when we talk about the diaspora begins with partition. And it begins with the Balkan Wars. And just before the Balkan Wars, when we have the first wave of Macedonians coming on Pechalbar, and then with the Balkan Wars and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, we start having these waves of people coming. And that Treaty of Bucharest in 1913 not only partitioned the region, it partitioned a language continuum. And so we have speakers who came from the territories that became Aegean Macedonia, who have a very different familial history on language and literacy from people who came 20, 30 years later from what became the Republic of Macedonia, and people who were relocated to Bulgaria or who moved to Bulgaria. So we have this very complex situation of a diaspora that bears the historical scars across the body politic of Macedonia. And so when I talk about language and this questionnaire, I began my questionnaire particularly with members of Aegean Macedonia in the diaspora, because there's a very different and palpable sense of what Macedonia meant, what was lost, and what can be regained and what can't be regained. So I just wanted to begin with that. One of the projects I'm working on is a history of Skopje through 100 years of postcards. So this wonderful postcard that you see here is a Bulgarian-produced postcard from 1912, when the glorious allies of Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro unite to drive the Ottomans out of the Balkan Peninsula, and a year later, they're going to fight over the spoils. So I was curious about symbolic heritage language. I was interested in language, how it transfers across generations, because there are these linguistic models that anyone who does language contact knows that the first generation moves, they have children, those children speak the mother tongue, but they're transitioning through school and whatever into the language of the diaspora, in this case, English. They have children who are that third generation, who now are English speakers who might have traces of their mother tongue. And then we see through generations, the diminution of the use of the mother tongue. Those in the contemporary era, with different aspects of travel and modes of communication, there's been some disruption in that transfer across 3 generations. And so I wanted to look at that. I wanted to look at the domains of language use, and I will explain in the next couple of slides what I mean there. And then I wanted to look at language and literacy, language and education, language and the cultural life of family and community, and importantly, the dichotomy that becomes very clear in the questionnaires between families' hopes and reality. When I just want to make sure I haven't messed my slides up already. The idea of this particular study came out of a number of things. So all the years and many years, when I first came to Toronto, I didn't know anything about the history of partition. I'm not Macedonian. And I was learning Macedonian in a period where there was a really strong push to consolidate the gains of Macedonian standardization. In Yugoslavia at that time, discussion of Aegean Macedonia was not, it wasn't completely taboo, but it was enough taboo that I really didn't know much about it. And so in the years that I was teaching here, I was teaching my students, but I was learning so much from the community. And so our classroom space became one of me talking about the critical importance of literacy and the standard language in order to have access to your history, to be recognized. In Southeastern Europe, you have a language and that's what makes you a people. But by the same token, I really came to learn the importance of spoken language, the specific fabric in the people's lives of their home dialect. And I wanted people to learn how to be bidialectal and to understand that we all hold multiple language codes at the same time. And so in my teaching, I became more and more open to standard language for written communication, but in spoken communication, I tried to open the door to allow people more ability to use their home dialects, because in Macedonia, even today, we hear home dialect and we hear dialect interacting with standard language all the time, and that's the reality of language. Another course I taught at the University of Toronto was something called Language, Politics, and Identity. It was my favorite class to teach after Macedonian. And in 2019, I had 50 students, and they spoke 46 different languages. And one day I was talking about language, and a lot of students began expressing to me, both in class and outside of class, their shame from all these different language traditions that they didn't speak their family language. And so one day in class, I said to them, you know, you might not speak your family language like you would have in your home country, but symbolic language will survive for generations. So I know people who don't know a word of Greek, but they call their grandmother Yaya. And that use of Yaya connects them to a past and identifies them with something critical that was from their past. It was kind of a toss out comment, but students were then emailing me and staying after class to tell me that that was very meaningful to them and was a step towards erasing some of their shame and embarrassment that they had somehow let their families down. So I began thinking, well, what is this symbolic language and how does it function and how do we access it? So in thinking about this, I thought it's important for us to consider who speaks what language to whom, when they speak it and why they speak it. What does it mean to speak a language? And what is a language anyway? And does it matter if languages collide? And what happens in that spark when languages do collide? And is that anything new? So this wonderful headline, I gave a talk ripping this headline out of a Macedonian newspaper years ago, Bashe oke da si cool. So this awesome sentence that was in a Macedonian newspaper mixes Bash, which is Turkish, which is Macedonian, okay, which is English, but now an internationalism, dasi, which is Macedonian, and cool, which is, you know, it's English. And that's a Macedonian sentence. It's a funny one, but it's a Macedonian sentence. So the point is that languages in human behavior mash up together. So let me see if I can, oh, hello, why are you not moving? So in point of fact, most speakers in most places at most times in the world have more than one linguistic code. And being monolingual is actually an exception rather than the rule. So early models of languages in diaspora talked about bilingual individuals. They talked about code switching. And so when you go to Montreal and you get the bonjour, hi, it's inviting people into code switching. It's saying, I don't know which code you use, but I'm okay with either code. And so we can accommodate to either code. And you get models like Spanglish, which is actually a quite stable and resilient. It's not code switching. We're not choosing between Spanish or English. We're speaking them both at the same time. And so keep tranquilo and habla Spanglish is telling the community, Basha, okay, you can be cool because all of us speak both codes. So we don't actually even think of them as two codes. We speak one code, and that code has elements that come from our two inherited codes. And so something like Spanglish or Singaporean English and these other contexts, they're not patois or creoles, which are in some ways longer lasting and more stable mashups. These are new kinds of languaging. And languaging is sort of language performance among communities that have more than one code. It's very playful. People move freely between codes to express different parts of themselves, different parts of their language heritage. And so we think about hybridity in all sorts of ways. Well, language ecology opens the door in a place like Toronto for all kinds of languaging performance and hybridity. And so what's happening in Macedonian families is you're experiencing this same kind of hybridity where you're not so much code switching between Macedonian code and English code. You all have all of it as a code, and you're intermingling in a very performative way to say things and communicate very special things to people who also share that hybrid code. So part of what I want to do today, I think it's very healthy when communities understand how these codes collide and reshape and hybridize, and how something new and generative comes out of that. So, Virginia, I'm glad you're laughing, because this is supposed to be very funny, and it's kind of a private joke for Virginia, but I'm going to let you in on it. So we think about languages in contact because we are urban cosmopolitans. But I was in Siberia, and I met a Siberianist who worked in the northernmost reindeer herding communities of Siberia. And he said, there are no pure dialects, because you know what humans really like? They like contact with other humans. And when they meet other humans, they share things. And one of the things they share is their language. And they share ideas, and they share objects, and objects come with words. So I was translating this book with Valerie Sylvester, who's also here, on a village history of Dumbany. And the very last thing to get translated was a page I realized that I really didn't want to translate because it was too hard. And I sort of pretended that I hadn't noticed, but Virginia and her people noticed that the translator had kind of cheated. And I had to do something about this list of games. So I'm faced with this list of games: Pet Kamenche, Jamli, Gel, Jelaka, Shumkovo, Dubka, Bishka, Football, Vojna, and Orlopani Dekapani. And what's so unusual about it is, if you look on the map that I've given you here, Dumbany is a small village in the mountains, kind of in the middle of nowhere, but that middle of nowhere happens to be where languages, cultures, religions, battles, soldiers, and lots of things happened that brought lots of people, different languages and customs into contact. And so this list of children's games, these are not multilingual ambassadors, and these aren't even people at the market exchanging goods. These are the names of games that children play in the village. Pet Kamenche, probably Pet Kamenche. 5 stones. It's a game kind of like jacks, and we can recognize pet and kamen. This is a Slavic root. It's diminutivized. We can recognize it as belonging to the linguistic code that is Macedonian. The next word, jamli, those are marbles. That word jam is the same word as glass. So you might recognize jamli gets borrowed into Macedonian from Turkish. The next word might be like rover, red rover, sensobi silver. The name of the game is gel, which happens to be the Turkish word for come. The more usual word in the village is probably ela. That comes from Greek. Doidi would be the Slavic word, but all of them got used because we all hear it all the time. It's like why we all say ciao, because it's something that just kind of spread. The next game I haven't figured out. I think it's the aorist past tense in Greek for I laughed. So again, it might be a laughing game. It might be a game where you're trying to tell jokes. I don't know. The next one, shumkavo dupka, bush in a hole. Totally Macedonian words. We recognize it. The next word, bishka. It's a great word. That ka suffix is Slavic, but the word bish for pig actually is a borrowing from Albanian. And the word in Albanian, bish, is the Indo-European word that's related to our word, beast. So beast in Albanian becomes specialized to the beast, which is the wild pig. That word gets borrowed into Macedonian, Slavicized with the suffix, and we have a bishka. Football, that is English language football, which probably through German or French comes into these local villages maybe through Pechalbar. Then we have vojna, unfortunately, a Slavic word that we all know too well, which means war. And then our last game, Orlopani Dekapani. All I can tell you is it's a naming game that involves guessing what family you're thinking about by naming where the eagle is and where the chicks are and where the hen is. And through those clues, we're going to come up with the name of the family. But Orlopani Dekapani is absolutely Kostursko Aegean dialect. So we see language contact is what languages are. Languages aren't in a vacuum. Humans interact, they borrow things, so hybridity is actually the history of human language. So I'm thinking about language and I'm thinking about hybridity and I'm thinking about my poor students who are feeling guilty, and I want to get at what's going on with this guilt. So I decided to do a questionnaire in a kind that I haven't really done for 30 years. Jim Hlavatch, a remarkable linguist in Melbourne, Australia, wrote an amazing book on Macedonian dialects in Greece, in the Aegean and dialects from the Republic of Macedonia and their interaction in Australia. It's a fabulous piece of research, and he brainstormed with me on my questionnaire. Elena Petroska and I did a study a number of years ago on language use among a diaspora in the United States. And so they shared with me their questionnaires for this new questionnaire on heritage language in Toronto. So as you can see what I'm trying to do, but it's the second paragraph here that I think is particularly important, that Macedonian here has followed that typical pattern of language shift that I described, of how it moves from first generation to second to third. So it's in many ways very similar to other languages in diaspora, but because Macedonia, through partition, and Macedonian, because of being a later codifying language than the other Slavic languages in the Balkans, and the particular ways in which Macedonia's neighbors have reacted throughout Macedonia's history to the language, the country, and its people, Macedonia's particular history has some unique features, and this research is trying to uncover some of what makes the Macedonian story unique amongst diaspora stories. So the first thing in the questionnaire is this biographical information. We're trying to, we means me, because I don't have a research team, trying to get at what are these people who are now here in diaspora. And, you know, in my own family, I'm from New England, and you can probably hear my United States East Coast dialect, even after 35 years in Canada. My husband is from Chicago, and he pronounces some words that I really don't like the way he says them, and I wish he just wouldn't pronounce them in front of my children. My parents were from Boston and New York City, and Richard's parents were from Connecticut and Chicago. And our parents' parents were from elsewhere, and our parents' parents' parents were the generation that came from away. So even in Richard and me having children in Toronto speaking two close but different US dialects with children who were born in Toronto, we say some things differently. And we have different sensibilities on what's grammatical and what isn't. We argue about lexicon. I knew I was going to love my father-in-law, peace to his memory, because he also called sub sandwiches grinders. So we bonded over this particular localism of what those sandwiches are called. So in order to understand the speech of my students, I need to know that story of, I need to know the origin story of how they got here. So I told you in this first round of questions, questionnaires, I got questionnaires back from these villages. My arrow moved, and I apologize for those of you who realize that now my Aegean dialects have moved into the middle of Greece. I'm not going to fix it right now. The postcard behind you is actually something for selling rice. It was apparently in 1913. It was packaged with the rice. And you'll notice that we now have, from that first postcard, we now have a postcard that shows the partition. And these dialects that we're looking at are actually tucked a little closer north and a little closer tucked up 12. They're closer into that corner of where what's labeled on the map in green here is Serbia, Albania, and Greece. So the next part of the questionnaire, and I told you you're going to get a lot of information about the questionnaire so that there's texture and you understand what I'm trying to do. So when we talk about domains, somebody just sent me an email the other day, which is like, and apparently it's circulating. I don't know, maybe it was on CNN. Oh my God, this guy is a janitor or a whatever, and he speaks 26 languages. And I sent an email back going like, yeah, whatever. Like, what does it mean to speak a language? Can that person discuss the state of the current ecology and the war in Ukraine in 26 languages? Probably not. Can he speak and write an essay in 26 languages? Probably not. So we know bits and pieces and parts, and we do languages, we do different things with them. It's like having a bunch of balls in our sport room, and some of them we use for baseball, and some of them we use for football, and some of them we play soccer with. So the first cut is, what language can you listen to and understand? What language can you communicate something in? In what language can you communicate something meaningful in? What language can you read? What language can you write in? In my classes, that's the first cut of talking about people talk about the 4 skills, and they're talking about listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Normally, one would add to that a cultural domain, and that's kind of what I'm getting at in these other domains. A lot of diaspora speakers across languages will say they speak Kitchen. We speak Kitchen Russian. We speak Kitchen Ukrainian. We speak Kitchen Macedonian. That's not a bad thing. That happens to be one of the most intimate domains of family life. So what are the languages we use when we're dressed down? And what are the languages we use when we're dressed up? And I would always tell my students, I'm trying to get you to understand that when you put on your fancy clothes, those are the situations in Macedonia where you'd use standard language. And when you kick back and put on your t-shirt and you put on your sweatpants and your fuzzy slippers, that's when you speak dialect. And you're allowed to have an informal and a formal self in your language. We have languages that take place in the intimate spheres of the home, and we have language that takes place in the public sphere. We have language that creates in-group, and we have language that's used for intergroup. And so these are different domains, and within those domains, we can further break it down in what's the language in the family? What happens when you engage in religious services, if you engage in them at all? What language do you go to school in? What language did your grandparents go to school in? What language did your grandparents go to school in? Did they get to go to school? How did they learn? What language do you work in? There are Macedonians who came here and who got jobs working in factories where they learned to speak German. Like, there's all kinds of strange things that happen in the workplace. It's why Quebec was so insistent on French being the language of the workplace, because it's a very significant domain. What's the language of sports? What language do we have? When we first moved here, and my husband's French is quite good, we turned on sports and he goes, oh my God, I don't understand a word of the Quebecois baseball announcer announcing baseball in French, because it's not a domain that he had language that he could communicate in. The most important domain for the first stage of my research is this symbolic domain. Even if you have no other language, you might know how to say Srećan Božić. If you don't know anything else, you might be able to say, alaldatie. You might be able to say, kiyadish kyotek. You might be able to say, you are a Buddha of the first order. So people may use symbolic language that it may be only one word, but it's communicating an entire cultural world behind it. So the next part of the questionnaire, and I know once you see this, you are not going to be lining up going, oh my God, send me the questionnaire. I know it's 18 pages, but I really want to do this. So the first part of the questionnaire is this self-assessment, and this is something that researchers do. They do a self-assessment, and then they follow up with oral interviews, where I'm asking people this first basic question on the domains of understanding spoken Macedonian, speaking, reading, and writing. A number of the question speakers said you need to break this down in literary or dialect. So it should probably have a finer grain. And then people were asked to rate on the scale. I can do anything and everything in it. I'm pretty good at a lot of it, but not all of it. Maybe so-so, well, only a little bit, some words here and there, and then not at all. And that not at all category, I think, would actually be quite rare. I know somebody else is admitting people. I will ignore that. So this gives me this first broad view of how live does this person feel Macedonian exists in these very standard domains of use. And then the next was to kind of break it out and to get at what these domains and the networks of language use. So people were asking these questions with follow-up. What on these topics do you speak with in what language? With your mother, with your grandmother, with your sister, with your children, with your grandchildren? Because languages don't occur in a vacuum. Languages occur because we want to communicate with people. So what language code do we feel that we're using the most with which people? And why is that? And so like jokes is a separate category. And I thought of that because there was a Portuguese professor at U of T who used to weed students out of the class who would come in saying, I have no Portuguese at all. My family, we just don't know any Portuguese. And then in the middle of class, he'd just say a joke. And the ones who started laughing were told they could now leave the class and he would see them in his second year Portuguese class. So there's language that gets used in specific situations, and the language becomes tied to those situational things. And many Macedonians might use, they might talk sports in Macedonian, they might talk about holidays in Macedonian, but they don't talk about finances in Macedonian. They don't talk about contemporary politics in Macedonian. They don't talk about going to the doctor in Macedonian. So starting to tease out, and it doesn't mean that they don't speak Macedonian, because most of us who are multilingual or polylingual in whatever way that is, whenever people ask me how many languages I know, I've begun answering the question by saying, if you hooked me up and flew me around the world in a helicopter and dropped me in various places, I have to think, in what language could I get by without starvation? Because that's a better gauge to me of how many languages I can communicate and develop a meaningful first conversation with people. Because if I get into, are you fluent? Well, I'm pretty fluent in Macedonian, but I can't explain to you what just happened at the dentist. And I can't explain to you about how taxes work in English, let alone Macedonian. And it even gets worse than that, because I realized in writing my Macedonian textbook that I knew the world from the point of view of a woman and not of a man. I didn't know how to say razor. I didn't know how to talk about men's clothing. I didn't know what my husband's relations would be, what he'd call my mother and father, but I knew what his mother and father would be called to me. So we develop our language capacity out of who we are and the networks of relationships that we have. So this all happens typically through an intergenerational transfer of language. So when we hear the tragedy of the residential schools, and we talk about the breaking of intergenerational transfer, and when we talk about Macedonian being forbidden in Greece and people being arrested, the whole purpose of that is to break the intergenerational transfer of language. That language moves, as I've said elsewhere, from mouth to ear across generations. So the questionnaire is trying to figure out how the Macedonians here learn. How did it happen? Did their parents learn to speak Macedonian? Did their grandparents? A lot of their grandparents speak Greek because they didn't get to learn Macedonian. Did they learn it from family and relatives? Could their grandparents read and write? Could their parents? And if so, how did they learn it? And if you don't know the answers to these questions and you still have living relatives, these would be good questions to ask. Did they share any stories or songs? And the questionnaire asks, can you tell them to me? And a lot of people wrote, yes, I can, but then they didn't tell me what they were. Also, again, getting back to these domains, are there particular moments when you switch languages? Like, would you all be in English and then you drop something on your foot and a profanity comes out of your mouth and it's in Macedonian? Would you speak only Macedonian, but your beloved spouse comes in bringing you a cup of coffee and you say, oh, srce? Emotional language might be a place, and that emotion might be punishment, it might be cursing, it might be greeting, it might be affection. So what are the triggers that cause us to choose one language over the other? So other questions that I'm not going to go into today ask about education. They ask about use of Macedonian media in the household, Macedonian identity in Canada and how important something like Canadian Macedonian Place is. Social life in Canada, things like Macedonian Historical Society, the Macedonian Film Festival. I'm trying to get at, again, how the networks of Macedonians connect across this city, and then how language travels across those networks. What really came out very clearly in the questions is this dichotomy that I'm calling between hopes and reality. Years ago, a Macedonian told me this, and I thought it was a very, very funny anecdote, where the grandparent comes in and says, "Šo praviš?" And the little kid answers, "Watching TV." So the grandparent is asking, "How are you doing?" And the kid knows enough Macedonian to know that "how are you doing" really means, "What are you doing?" And so they answer with what they're doing, which is the wrong answer to the question. And I felt that this kind of got at that dichotomy between hope and reality. This comes through crystal clear in the questionnaires. Over and over again, people say, yes, it's vitally important for the language to be passed on to the next generation. But it's clear from everywhere else that they weren't able to pass it on in the complete way that they dreamt that they thought they could do it. There's a lot of reasons why that happens, but the parents, like the children in my class who were experiencing shame and embarrassment, the parents and grandparents were also experiencing shame and embarrassment that they didn't do what they were supposed to do. They didn't create a Macedonian-speaking household. Well, guess what? Research has shown repeatedly over and over and over again in every community that it's beyond the capacity of most parents to transfer a complete box that has Macedonian as the sole language of communication. That's largely because you're living in a place of hybridization, and you've got kids who are 3 culture kids, 2 culture kids. And what you've typically passed on is a community in which Shoprais might be answered watching TV. But watching TV means, Dedo, I know it's you, and I understood that you're talking to me, and I kind of get your question. And so we have this network of communication that happens to be mixed code. So in the last part of my talk, I just want to take you through some questions 7, 8, and 9, which I think were the ones where my ideas about symbolic language really began to become really clear. Is it important for you to maintain the use of the Macedonian language or your home dialect? Inevitably, the answer was yes, it's extremely important, even though that actually didn't happen. If you don't speak or understand Macedonian, what are some things that you do that take the place of language? Well, people were very forthcoming. Some go to church, some go to dance groups, some go to historical societies, some people watch Macedonian movies, some people watch Macedonian on videos on YouTube. People share customs, they honor the dead through these things, they color eggs, they do a lot of performative Macedonian things. Even if they say they have no language, they actually have expressions like Yada Kyotek, which isn't a very nice one. It means to get a beating. I'm sorry, it's a nice Turkism. You're going to eat the beating. Nema problem. They're going to have Baba and Dedo. They're going to have terms of affection and abuse, Srce and Budala. I want you in your minds to underline Baba and Dedo and actually put a double underline under Baba, because it is the answer that I heard the most. And I'm going to explain at the very end why I think that is. It's pretty obvious, but it was so clear that I think it's kind of fun to tease it out. Are there any words that you think you have to know to be Macedonian? Baba, Dedo, Ivar, Lep, Budala. I got all kinds of things. And are there Macedonian words you've taught your non-Macedonian friends or partners? Same words: food, culture, affection, greetings, expressions so that we know how to share in the rituals of being Macedonian through that shared linguistic culture. Language attitudes. Is it important to pass on? How and why? And the hows were really interesting because I know it didn't happen the way they thought they could do it. And do you mix languages, and does that matter to you? And I hear a lot of, I speak Skršeno, I speak broken, I speak Selsko. Well, it doesn't matter. What you're communicating is membership in a Macedonian cultural sphere. And no matter what language you have, those pieces of language engage you in the ritualized function of language that conveys group membership. So I've said these were the first responses, and taking from this these Shoprai, Spolaiti, Chestitki, Zelnik, Tafte, Baba, Dedo, Kum, Nunko, I've come up with these conclusions about these being cultural markers, and they deeply resonate across generations, and they serve to underline that some language is better than no language. That this language anxiety that people feel actually decreases the use of the family's heritage language. Parents are embarrassed to use it because they don't speak it as well as they should. Children then feel embarrassed because they didn't learn enough and they let their parents down. People don't realize how extremely difficult it is to create bilingual children, especially when both parents are working. And then they need to come home and they're tired and they need to cook and they have to help with homework. And there's kind of a lot going on, and they may be helping the grandparents who've been busy in the house all day. It's just too much to do. So even where full transmission of heritage language has been impeded, they still need to acknowledge the cultural transmission through language, which has taken place. So that concept of heritage language and translanguaging, I hope, changes the narrative for native speakers. and heritage speakers. And it allows them to feel the power of the connection through the bits and pieces that they have, even if they don't fully control the heritage language. It allows them, I would hope then, to leverage that symbolic function to erase the discomfort and embarrassment so that they feel more positive and that those language about their abilities, and that allows them to continue to pass on that significant cultural linguistic heritage and maybe expand it and encourage people to use more of it. And I'm just going to move through this, that they need to promote the idea that a little language is better than nothing. And I think of that Tim Hortons ad where, you see somebody with that coffee cup and they go, they're Canadian because that's a Tim Hortons cup. When somebody throws in a Macedonian word, it's a secret handshake. And Macedonians recognize each other because in that crowded field, somebody said, Hayde. And that missing H on the Turkish Hayde is a signal that you're speaking Macedonian. So there are these secret codes that even a little is better than nothing. Even if you're speaking Selsko and you're mixing code, you are engaging in fluent intergenerational communication through a fluent interlanguage. And that interlanguage is deeply inflected with love for, concern about, and interest in the inherited Macedonian language and the cultural world it describes. There was an interesting article in the Atlantic magazine recently about family lect, which are the unique ways in which families build specialized vocabularies that creates a sense of belonging. And I want to extend that notion of family lect to the diaspora family, which creates this very unique and special way of speaking to one another that might be interdialectal. It may be standard mixed with dialect, and it may be standard mixed with dialect, mixed with English, mixed with French, mixed with other. Many Macedonian families are not Macedonian, they're Macedonian Italian, they're Macedonian something. And that family lect still has openings for Macedonian to be a part of that, conveying that cultural world. As I've described elsewhere, if we imagine the Macedonian cultural world and the Canadian cultural world as two land masses, it would be ideal if there was a super highway of communication across it. That's the goal. That's what I was trying to do in my class, is create diaspora speakers who can get on that highway, even if they're in the slow lane. They feel the passage across those two land masses. But my second point here, second, third, and fourth generation speakers actually know more than they think they do, but they've become so conditioned to lamenting their lack of high-speed transit that they fail to see the rich value in the stepping stones that they do have. And if they could imagine this as these stepping stones connecting these two cultural worlds, and how every word that you learn, every word retained is a stepping stone that helps movement across. So the more language, the more stones, the stronger bridge, the greater move there is between cultures and generations. Symbolic language isn't nothing. When I learned why zdravets, how Macedonians planted zdravets in their front yards, the wild geranium, as a signal to other Macedonians that somebody who knows you and your culture and your language lives here. And zdravets comes from that root meaning health. That's a pretty powerful symbol. The University of Toronto uses a dead language, as many universities do in their motto. Why is that? Because they are signaling that they are the continuation of traditions that extend back to antiquity, where Latin was the language of education and culture. And by having a motto in Latin, even if students have to look it up every time, it's something about the tree grows, knowledge, I don't know, whatever. They are participating in the symbolic connection to the early days of the academy. It's not nothing when the Niagara Falls was lit up in red and gold. If you didn't know what that red and gold was for, it doesn't matter. It looks kind of awesome. But if you did know and you were part of that secret handshake, you were part of something very, very powerful. When we travel up Spadina and we see the news sign that says Ishpadina, which is the Athabascan Anishinaabe name for Spadina, it's not reclamation for the loss of intergenerational transfer and the loss of language, but it is saying, we see you in the landscape. Your language is part of this landscape, and language belongs to people who speak that language. You are seen. And that's what we're trying to do with symbolic language. So I want to come back to the idea of the Baba. It turns out, not surprisingly, but I'd see it in very few papers on diaspora language, that of course grandmother is the word, even more than dedo, that passes on, because the grandmother ends up being a profoundly important linchpin in the cultural transmission of language. The children typically were in the care of Baba before they went to school. And while they were in the care of Baba, Baba was cooking, and they were learning food names from Baba. Babas, more than dedos, were in charge of the rites and the celebrations. And so Babas carried on a lot of traditional knowledge that dedos also had, but dedos went on Pechalbar. Dedos had to learn the language of the army. The Babas were home speaking the home dialect. And so that the word for grandmother in so many cultures is people have no other word from their home language. They have the word for grandmother. As I began to do this questionnaire, I asked my husband, I said, so I know like your grandparents all spoke English and you had a great grandfather who spoke German, but I know you don't have any German. Like, what about your dad's mom? I know she was fluent in Welsh. And he said, oh yeah, she wrote poetry in Welsh. Welsh was her first language. And I said, well, didn't you get any Welsh? And he said, no, nothing. Welsh, it was not part of our cultural heritage. The only thing we got was, it's kind of weird. We called her Grandma Nine. Well, I'm a linguist, so I get on my computer and I look up in the Oxford English Dictionary. Oh, look at that, Grandma Nine. It's the word for grandmother in Welsh. So Richard's grandmother didn't pass on anything, but what she wanted to be called was Nine. She wanted to be connected through the effective language of being a grandmother to that whole cultural world that being a grandmother meant. And my husband, without knowing it, was carrying a shard of carried culture that was, to take the name from a Ukrainian movie in tribute, it's like the shadows of forgotten ancestors. And with carrying the word for grandmother, he's trailing with him that long history of troubles, migration, and the histories of the people who came before us, who brought us to this diaspora to create our new cultural universe. Thank you.
If I can borrow from Christina's talk, she talked about cultural markers. Well, for 31 years, the Canadian Macedonian Historical Society has been a cultural marker here in this city. She talked about how we connect across the city. Well, we've been connecting across this community here in Canada and Toronto and globally once we got into the World Wide Web for at least the last 20 years. She talked about communicating membership. We've been communicating membership of our heritage, and that's what the Historical Society is about. And we want to continue that by creating these gatherings. I know that the former U of T students who took Christina's Macedonian course occasionally get together and they have, say, a chat where they'll just talk Macedonian at the gathering. Maybe we can pair up with some of those people who have organized something like that to organize that with the Historical Society and have some kind of future event that will be open to everyone and will be live in person instead of Zoom. And I'd like to thank Christina. I'd like to thank Virginia and Stephanie. Christina, yourself, you have been an unwavering supporter of our community. You have been a cultural marker for our community, and you continue to do so. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and thank you for our board, from our board of directors. It's been a pleasure to hear you, and I know we're seeing each other in Zoom, but hopefully the next time we can chat in Macedonian at a gathering, have some coffee, and have some maybe people telling us about our fortunes in our coffee cups. But we're looking forward to that. We'd like to connect with our next lecture on May 28th. That is the day, so mark it in your calendar. You will receive a notice on MailChimp, and we will be posting on Facebook and on Instagram. Once again, thank you to all of those who participated in this event, and we look forward to seeing you again. And please either renew your membership, become a member, or support us in any way you can. We do need members, even on the board, to help us to come up with new ideas and new ways to create new markers and new community, and to explore other ways that we can let people know about our heritage, and language is a big part of it. Thank you again, and we hope to see you soon.